So a very warm welcome. In today's session, we are about to start app development with Swift Associate Program. In the program, we are going to cover up the following objective domain. In this course is targeted towards users or individuals who wants to earn app development with Swift Associate certifications. And we are going to perform a lot of demonstration. In this, you will be able to get knowledge of impact of computing, impact of apps on the society, economies and cultures, and you will be exploring various iOS app development processes in this. This course is defined in the following verticals, where we will get started with planning, design, and theory, followed by project navigation. In the third section, we are going to build interfaces for iOS, followed by we are going to understand Swift programming language and concepts of debugging. So there are various subtopics which we will be covering during this program. We are going to get started with planning, design, and theory, where you are going to understand the design cycle. In the design cycle, we are going to understand how we plan designs, how do we build prototypes, followed by how we evaluate the designs. Then we are going to understand how sensitive data can be protected and compromised. So when it comes to sensitive data, we have to ensure the principles of security, where we have to understand how we share personal and application information, what are the kind of security challenges which are available when it comes to iOS app development. Then what are the legal, ethical, and socio-economic impacts we are going to understand in first week, followed by we'll get into second week, as in we are going to have a combination of these topics so that we can follow a complete hierarchy of building the applications. In the project navigation, we are going to understand what are the basic file types in an iOS project, so that we can understand what are the important relevant files and how do we access these files. Secondly, we are going to recognize the assets available in a project. So what kind of assets are available? How do we deal with images, media files? We are going to understand this. How do we define assets? Use them. We are going to understand that. Followed by, we are going to understand how the asset has to be used correctly in the project and how we have to ensure the security so that the assets doesn't get compromised. Followed by, we are going to understand how we implement appropriate actions to hide, show different areas of the user interfaces and various other event handling procedures we will look into. Followed by, we will be building interfaces for iOS, where you are going to understand how do we create a storyboard and how do we document, how do we follow a outline in order to build the application. Followed by, we're going to understand how attributes inspector work and how we can modify the properties of objects and views non-programmatically using the attributes inspector. So this is also a very important tool which we will learn in this. Followed by, we're going to understand what is a storyboard, how UIKit object work on a storyboard, and how we can differentiate between button outlets and the actions. So we're going to understand all of these things. Followed by, we'll get into the Swift language, where you will understand the how functions are created in Swift, how write mechanism, call mechanism, or evaluation mechanism of labels, parameters, and return statements are implemented in Swift. We are going to understand it. Followed by, we are going to understand the results using various mathematical operators and various operators, programming operators used in Swift. So we are going to understand them and we are going to evaluate those results. Followed by, we are going to understand and evaluate the structures also, where you are going to declare the properties, initialize the properties, you're going to define the methods, you're going to create instances of the structures, and you're going to use those instances. So we are going to implement it. Followed by, we'll be working with data structures, arrays, and we'll be working on declaring and initializing of the arrays, modification of the arrays, and evaluating the array properties and the methods as per our development requirements. Then we'll get into the control flow steps, where you are going to create, analyze, and predict loop structures. We are going to implement loops. Followed by, we are going to implement a lot of conditional statements, which we use in Swift programming language. Then you're going to write your enumerations. You're going to create constants and variables, and you'll understand how type inferences and typecasting is done so as to convert values from one type to other type. Followed by, we'll see how explicit typing is done. So this will be taken. We also will be following naming conventions, and we already understand naming conventions are very important when it comes to application reverse engineering, because name mangling and demangling, all these processes are very important when we create hooks and tweaks for the applications. Followed by, we are going to make use of the connections inspector in order to evaluate whether a connection error has occurred. We are going to debug our applications by setting up the breakpoints, controlling those statements using our flow control, and executing statements step by step and modifying. Once we modify, we will be able to differentiate between the syntax and the runtime errors, and we will be able to build and run the apps in a reverse oriented fashion. Followed by, we'll be understanding error messages in console and how to rectify them. Followed by, we'll understand the breakpoints, how do we use breakpoints, and why they are very, very important when it comes to building the application and reverse engineering the application. So this is going to be the overall objective which we will be covering in this course. So today we'll get started with planning, designing, and theory. So let's quickly get into Apple design lifecycle. So first article which I'm showing you is iOS app lifecycle. Okay, so this is a very, very important stuff when it comes to your application lifecycle. This is very important because whenever we get into building any application, we always have to understand what is the life cycle, how the application runs, and what are the important classes and methods gets executed whenever you run an application. Okay. Now here I'm going to show you all the kinds of methods which are used, and I would like to prefer the standard life cycle from Apple itself. We have got it attached, unattached, then responding to various. Okay, just allow me 1 minute. This one is the first one in the life cycle, or I'll get into app structure. Then we have user interactions, user interfaces, graphic drawing, printing, text, classes, and this. So I'll get into app and environment. Okay. So I would like to take an image. Yeah, I think this one, we have a delegate, we have a view controller, then we have a view. We have the operating system, main loop, core objects, fine. Not running foreground active. Okay. Main UI application, UI file. Where do we have view did load? Application launching आ गया, deactivation हो गया, ठीक है. So we'll follow this article. Okay. So let me just. यहाँ से ना हमारे पास एक प्रॉपर फ्लो आना चाहिए यार. So anyways, I'll use this one. Okay. So now, so whenever we get started with building an application, it's very important to understand the life cycle of how an application works. So this should always be the first step whenever we get started with any app development course or any app development process. So now here, whenever we click on an application, okay, so what happens? We call that process as a startup. So during the startup, the UI application main function sets up several key objects and starts the app. At the heart of every iOS app is the UI application object, whose job is to facilitate the interactions between the system and the other objects in the application. So what do we have is, whenever we build up an application, applications are always created with an MVC format. Okay, we always call this as a model view controller kind of an architecture. So iOS applications are built with model, views, and controllers. So what is a model? Model is always known as the database connections. Okay. However, you will be handling your data in the application will always be controlled with a model. Then the user interfaces, the UI, which we say the front end, is controlled through the view section, and the logical part, the code logic or the backend logic, whatever we write in order to run our application, that is controlled using a controller. So this architecture is known as an MVC architecture, model view controller architecture. Pratik, is that clear?
Yes.
Now in the model view controller objective, very first thing whatever we do is, whenever we get started with designing an application, we always focus towards the data objects first and the documents and the files first, that what exactly needs to be built. Followed by, we build the user interfaces, the views. So within this user interfaces, what do we have is, we have various views created. We create multiple views and the user interface objects, and all these user interface objects are displayed in a UI window in the mobile phone. Now this UI window is actually controlled using the view controllers. Okay. So what is a view controller? View controller is something which is going to, where you are going to define an application delegate, which means your main logic. And this main logic will be transmitting data to the view controllers. And these view controllers will be interacting with the view components and the UI components so as to ensure the functioning of the application. Okay. And this complete application delegate, view controllers, view objects will all be available and controlled with the UI application. Is that clear?
Yes.
Now, so this is the standard model view controller architecture. Now, what exactly happens next? Now, so the UI application object manages the event loop and other high-level app behaviors. It also reports key app transitions and some special events such as push notifications and various notifications, transmission from one activity to other activity or one page to other page. So one view to other view, all this is handled with the UI application part. Now, what it does, it communicates to its delegate, which we always call as app delegate file in the iOS project. So what is an app delegate? It is a custom object which we define in order to access the views and other objects, UI objects, in order to function our app. The app delegate is the heart of your custom code. Okay. So whenever you write a code, app delegate is the starting point, or you can consider it. Pratik, is my voice audible? I think I got.
Yes. Yeah.
Is it clear now?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, great. So now, so what we'll do now, once the main app runs, what exactly happens? So the UI application object sets up the main run loop at the launch time, and it uses various events and it handles those events on the basis of interaction with the user interfaces. Okay. So as the name suggests, you can see the main loop executes on the app's main thread, which means, so whenever we start an application, there are multiple threads we have. So we have a main thread. Okay. Main thread is somewhere where the user interface runs. We call it as a main thread. Along with the main thread, what do we have is we do have various background threads. Okay. There could be n number of threads which we might be running in, and you can consider these threads as the parallel processes. Okay. We call it as background threads. So background threads, you can execute operations like, let's say, connecting to internet, or performing some long running operation. So what do we generally do? We try to separate these operations from the main thread so that the functioning of app shouldn't hang or something like that. Because let's say if there is a long running operation, by the time you won't be able to use the app if you will be running those operations within the main thread. So that is why what we do, we try to create separate threads, and in those separate threads, we perform various different operations. And once those operations are completed, then what we do is we send the result back to the main thread, and through that, the data is actually displayed on the user interfaces, which the user is using. Is that clear? Main
Yes.
thread is always known as the UI thread also. Our graphical user interface always runs through the main thread, and all other operations we can create background threads and we can run those operations there. So we'll have these tested. We are going to create various main threads and background threads so that you will have the idea. Now, so this behavior ensures that the user related events are processed serially in the order in which they were received. What exactly happens now? Suppose you are using the application. Okay. You have performed some touch event, let's say. So through that, whatever interaction has been done, it will communicate to the iOS operating system. Now through that, what will actually happen? Through a communication port, it is going to send the request to the event queue, and the event queue is going to execute or communicate with the main loop, which in turn communicates with the application object, which in turn communicates with the core objects like the data objects and things like that. Followed by, once the computation is done, the response will be given back to the OS, and then OS is going to display that outcome or output of that on the application interface. So this is something which happens. Now taking
So sir, there are 8 steps, right? मतलब please थोड़ा scroll up करेंगे.
Yeah.
ये 8 step का है ये पूरा process if we count.
Right. So 8th step ऐसा वो नहीं है. This is just the functioning of the main loop, and you have to understand that main loop will always be running so that it can support the UI thread, so that your UI is always visible on the mobile device. Okay. So that is something like a main loop.
So इसमें भी hooking आ सकता है, right? There are steps.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
yeah.
ठीक है sir.
Now coming to the next part. So what are the execution states of the application? This is very important. So there will be status when your application, I'll connect it and I'll show you. Just allow me a minute. Okay, so what I'll do, we are going to try. Yeah, here. So suppose now what are we trying to understand? We're trying to understand this life cycle. Okay. So whenever we execute an application or whenever an application is installed on a mobile device, so we have to understand the execution state of the application. So by default, the application will be in a not running state. So currently, let's say if I talk about YouTube, okay, I'll do one thing. Let me just quickly see in case if I am getting any app running in the background. No application is running in the background at the moment. So consider we are going to work out with YouTube as an application. So currently, as you can see, that YouTube is not running in my mobile phone. It is simply installed on iOS. So what it does, from not running app, it goes to an inactive state. So there's a foreground of the mobile device and there's a background of the mobile device. Okay. Foreground is currently where currently you are seeing this menu. Okay. The launcher menu. We call it as the launcher menu. Okay. So currently we are seeing the launcher in the foreground and our app is inactive at the moment. It is not running. What will we do? As soon as I click on it, okay, so you can see that the application will be on a launch state and now this application becomes active. Currently, this is active, okay, installed and currently active. Now what is happening? When it is active, it will be displayed in the foreground. So currently you can see that this is my mobile phone's foreground and I can see that that application is running and it is active at the moment. So active application will always be there in the foreground. Okay. Now, once you make this application inactive, as in it is running, but currently inactive. In that case, what will happen? That will go to the background and it will be running in the background. Okay. Is that clear? And yes. From the background, once you suspend the application, it will again go back to the not running state. Okay. So what I'll do, if I just shift it like this, so currently the application is running because suppose if I play a song or anything like that, the song will remain continuous. Let's say if I'm playing this, suppose. Okay. So now, suppose this is playing. Now what am I doing? If I just pause it, okay, even though now the application is in the background and in an inactive state, even though it is in an inactive state, you can see that it got hold at that particular location. Okay. What I can do is I can suspend it from here. If I suspend the application from here, it will again go back to the not running state. That means it's closed. So I believe this is clear.
Yes.
Now we'll get into the next part here. So these are the following states. Not running state, the app has not been launched or was running but was terminated by the system. Inactive means the app is running in the foreground but is currently not receiving events. It may be executing other code. An app usually stays in the state only briefly as it transitions to a different state. That means we won't be able to interact it, but still it will be running in the background as an inactive application. Okay. Then once the application is in an active state, it will be able to receive the events, whatever you are transmitting. Okay, is that clear? So we can interact with the application. We can use our gestures in order to interact with it. Followed by, we do have the background and the suspended states. Now here comes the most important part. Okay, this one is very, very important. This is something happens when we launch an application. So suppose you have launched YouTube. So once you launch, you're going to tap on this icon. Okay. Once you tap on this icon, what will happen? There will be a main method which will be executed. Okay. With this main method, what next will happen? There will be a UI application main function which is going to be executed, which will eventually load the user interface file. Once the user interface file is loaded, it is going to be initialized. Okay. Now, once it initializes, what happens? From the initialization step in your code, there will be a class or there will be an event which will occur, which will be known as will finish launching with options. Okay. Is that clear? So on initialization, your application code will be executed, followed by an event will finish launching. Then what will happen? Your UI state will be restored. And once your UI state is restored, there will be various methods which would be initialized and which might be called, followed by your final initialization. Once we call final initialization, which means this method is going to be executed, did finish launching with options. So what will happen? Initially, once we launch an application, this will occur, will finish launching, and followed by did finish launching with options, which means the application is launched after the final initialization. And then the application gets activated and it starts running. Is that clear? This process is known as activate the app. And how did it become active? There is a function which gets executed. Application did became active. Okay, is that clear?
Yes.
Now, once the application gets activated, there is an event loop which will automatically be running 24/7 until and unless you switch to a different app or close the app. Okay, so what happens? So there is a main event loop which will be continuously running. And why this will be running? This will be continuously running to receive the events or to handle the events. These events could be anything like a user interaction, a mouse click, a drag drop, or anything, any operations which we might be interested to handle. Is that clear?
Yes.
Then what we can do is either we can suspend the app, close the app, or switch to a different app. So this process is known as launching an app into the foreground. So are you clear with what happens? Whenever we are going to click on it, a main function will be called, then UI application main will be called, our UI file will be loaded, followed by there will be certain methods which will be called, will finish launching and did finish launching. And finally, our application will be loaded, will be running, and the application will be activated. Once it gets activated, we will be able to handle the events, which means all the interactions from the user will be handled. And then we will be able to switch between the apps, suspend the apps, and we can do any of the operations as per our choice. I believe this is clear.
Okay, so that's this is the reason you were stressing more on I should know programming.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
No, I was not aware about all these steps and.
Yes,
Okay.
this is very, very important because only then we will be able to understand then when an application is launched, where we would be setting the breakpoints. So now in case if you will be working towards hacking any of the application, okay, in every application there will definitely be a main function always. Okay, there will always be a UI application main function. There will always be a user interface which will be loaded. There will always be these methods would be called before the application starts running. Okay, so what we were trying to do initially during handling of the events, we were setting the breakpoints here. Okay, if we know a method, only then we will be able to set up a breakpoint. But if we know the complete life cycle, we would be able to set a breakpoint here, and then we can go step by step, you know, by calling the flow control and everything. So we will be eventually able to reach out to any of the methods which is available in that application, and we will be able to interact with it. Okay.
Okay.
Got it?
I got it, sir. Thanks for saving my life.
Yeah. Okay. So I believe this is clear. This is the launch cycle. Now, once we are clear with the launch cycle, we'll get into the how it will get into the background. So the previous step which you have seen was how application will be displayed in the foreground. When you click on an application, how it will come to the foreground as in front of the user. Then what happens when it goes into the background? So into the background, what happens? So once you switch into other application, what is going to happen? This process will happen. Your application will enter into a background. Okay. In a background, there will always be a check that do you want this application to be continuously running? If you say yes, it will be monitoring events continuously. It will be handling events. In case if you don't allow it, so what it does, this application will be suspended. And once it gets suspended, the application is going to sleep. Okay, is that clear? So you have various options. Either in the background also you can allow application to handle the event. So you have to write the correct methods. In fact, you can also suspend it. So I'll give you an example of YouTube normal and YouTube premium. So what exactly happens? Suppose you want to convert your YouTube normal to YouTube premium. What you can actually do, when your application is going into background, by default, what happens, YouTube suspends the application. They call this function on a normal YouTube application. Okay. So due to that, the reason is whenever he goes into a background, there is a method which is being called application did enter the background, and it goes into a suspended state. Now, what you can actually do, you can write a tweak for this method. Okay. And before getting it into the sleep, you can modify the tweak and you can actually write this particular part where you can still handle the events. So when you handle those events, when you write such a tweak, your normal YouTube will always be running as a premium YouTube. Okay, which means it will always be running in the background also, and it will be monitoring the events and playing the audio and everything like that. Is that clear?
Yes.
So tweaks would be beneficial here. So if you understand what are the standard methods being called and how the application lifecycle works, you will be able to tweak it and modify it as per your choice. Okay, got it?
Yes.
Now we'll get into the next step. So that was launching an app from the background. Now what happens? Whenever user switches to a different application, suppose you were currently using YouTube, but somehow you got a notification from LinkedIn or from WhatsApp or any other, and you switched the application. So once you switch the application, currently what happens? Your current application in the foreground will be deactivated. Okay. So in the deactivation process, which method will be called? This method will be called application will resign active. This is a method which you can override in the code. Application will resign active. Okay. Now you deactivate it and it enters the background. When it enters the background, now this methodology will be called application did enter the background. This function will be called as soon as it launches, as soon as it gets into the background. Now you have to decide whether do you want to allow it to run or do you want it to close it. So if you close it, what happens? It will get into the suspended state where the application is going to sleep. Okay. And you will be able to switch back to this application. Either in case if there is a memory pressure or something like that, you can always terminate the application also. Okay. So both ways we can handle the application lifecycle. Is that clear?
Yes.
So application lifecycle is very, very important. Why are we understanding this? Because there will be different kinds of applications which you want it to be running even in the background. For example, WhatsApp. Okay. So in case if you have not handled these methods properly while development of an application, so as soon as you put your application into the background, it might get deleted or it might get closed. But majority of the times, what do we really want is, even if we are not using the application, we want the application to be running in the background, like WhatsApp, because even if you're not using WhatsApp, you might be interested that if somebody is messaging you, your application should be able to read those messages and keep it. And whenever you get time, you'll quickly open the WhatsApp application, and all those content which were not visible earlier because your application was in background will now be accessible. Is that clear?
Yes.
So that's why it's very, very important to understand how the life cycle works of the application. Now, so this is it about the application life cycle and the application running strategies. So I believe you are now clear with how iOS application life cycle works. Okay. Yes. Secondly, we are getting into an important stuff, and this stuff is iOS design principles. Okay, there are design patterns as well as design principles. So we will be working towards the design guides, the app design guidelines, and the inspirations, and how can we build various designs with Adobe XD. All of these things needs to be understood. Okay, so I'll quickly get into this. So iOS is a platform where design goes back to its roots. So along with uh, various layout structures, typography, all these design things needs to be understood when it comes to building iOS applications. Okay, so in the design part of this, you'll actually understand here. So in the iOS, you can actually get here on this website, developer.apple.com, there is a section design section. Okay, so what you can do when you are starting Swift programming, you can actually design and debug iOS, iPad apps, Mac OS, tvOS, watchOS. Okay, all these things can be built, and we have to understand what are the human interface guidelines which we should follow in order to design great applications that integrate seamlessly with Apple platforms. This is something which we want to do. Okay, along with there are various information like Apple Design Awards, symbols from Apple, making apps accessible, building apps for the world. Okay, designing accessories, all that stuff is available over here. So what we'll do, we'll get into reading the human interface guidelines. Now, when we come to human interface guidelines for the design, I'm talking about this particular part of the course where we are actually getting into the design cycle. Okay, through this, we'll be able to brainstorm, as in we'll be able to understand what needs to be built, followed by we'll be able to plan, prototype, and evaluate. Now, what do we really need to do? So we have to get in-depth information and the UI resources for designing great apps that integrate seamlessly with Apple platforms. So since we will be hacking mobile applications, iOS applications, so our primary focus will be the iOS, but later you can extend these strategies to build for Mac OS, for watchOS, and for tvOS also. Is that clear?
Yes.
But currently we'll get into iOS. Now, when we come into iOS, what do we have here is we have iOS design themes. Okay, this is very important, iOS design themes. So we will be able to design iOS applications for vertical layouts, portrait layouts, landscape layouts, for iPads, for all that stuff. Now, there will be a few things which we should be understanding. What are the themes? What are the interface essentials? Followed by what is the application architecture? This is very, very important. How user interactions are done. We have to understand all of these. Followed by system capabilities, how the visual designs work, how the icons and images are used, what are the image sizes. Okay, all of these things needs to be understood. What kind of view controls are available, how we can make use of these views in order to make our applications look good, all those things. Now, so as an app designer, you have the opportunity to deliver an extraordinary product that rises to the top of the App Store charts. To do so, you will need to meet high expectations for quality and functionality. And there are three primary different iOS themes from the iOS platforms. What do we really need to do? We always have to understand the clarity, the difference, and the depth. Okay, so what do we mean by this? Throughout the system, text is legible at every size. Icons are precise and lucid. So what do we really need to do? We need to understand the concepts of the negative space, color, fonts, graphics, and what are the interface elements which we can highlight and which we can use so as to properly convey the interactivity and deliver the important content to the user. So if we have a proper clarity and if we have the understanding of all these color, fonts, graphics, interfaces, we will be able to deliver important content. Is that clear?
Yes.
Now, then we have difference, which means fluid motion and a crisp, beautiful interface help people understand and interact with the content while never competing with it. So we'll be working towards it, understanding of how we can minimize the use of gradients, colors, schemes, drop shadows, and all that stuff, so that we can ensure that the content, whatever we are delivering, is a paramount. Okay. Then what do we have is the depth. So distinct visual layers and realistic motions, along with the hierarchy of the components, how to facilitate the understanding whatever message we want to convey through that application, followed by how the touch facilities and various other sensor-based controls or gesture-based controls can be actually used in iOS. That is all very important, which we have to learn. Now, coming into the design principles, these are some of the following important things. One is the aesthetic integrity is very important. Consistency is very important. Direct manipulations is very important. Getting the feedback from the user, meta first, user control, all of these things needs to be understood when it comes to the design part. Okay, is that clear?
Yes.
Then what things we have is we have the interface essentials, that what all do we have in the interface and how we have to get the things designed, and then how we get into the security side of it. Okay, so in the interface essentials, there are various things like the bars. There could be a tab bar. Okay, then you have the views where you have your text, graphics, animations, and all your interactive elements within your app, and followed by the controls, which means what all actions you will be able to perform through these controls. And the control fields are something like buttons, switches, text fields where you can enter the information, and your progress indicators. So these are the interactive controls which are very, very important when it comes to design. Is that clear?
Yes.
Now, so we'll get into the next process of launching. So what do we do is, whenever we have to get started with a design, we have to provide a launch screen. Then we have to properly launch with the appropriate orientation, whether in a vertical mode or whether in a vertical mode or in the landscape mode. Followed by, we have to understand how the setup information is done and how it will be, how the gestures will be set up, and how other important component, the interactive component of the app will be set up. So all those things we need to do. Okay. So we'll be working out on it, on the designs and things. So these are the strategies which we need to follow through this human interface guidelines article when it comes to iOS app development. Is that clear?
Yes.
So now what we'll do in the next session, we'll get into development of the prototype and evaluation with a basic project, so as to understand how that launch process, which we have previously read, will work, and how the design theory will be integrated into that app component, into the app concept. Okay. And followed by, in the next session, we'll get into the security challenges and all the security things which we might need to consider before getting started with the application development process. Clear?
Yes.
Okay. So for today, what do you need to do? You need to go through with the application lifecycle processes, the articles which I've already shared with you. So you have to go through with them, and so that once we start building this application tomorrow, you will be able to match up each of those functions which we just discussed through the life cycle. We will be coding and modifying those functions tomorrow in the code. So you have that relevant understanding of how in sequence those methods are being called in order to ensure the foreground running of the application and background running of the application. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So that's all for the day. We'll catch up in some time for the security session.
Okay, so shall I take 5 minutes break?
Yeah, absolutely. Take some break.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot, sir.
We'll join in 10 minutes.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah, you too.